glance, yesterday's jobs report seemed to paint a pretty positive picture of the economy, but dig a little deeper and the result is perhaps not quite so rosy, with a sharp drop in the number of people in full-time employment. While it may seem that full-time work is hard to come by, research by Robert Half has found that temporary contracts can be a valuable stepping stone for job seekers. For more on the report, we're joined by Andrew Brushfield. He's director of Robert Half Australia, live from Melbourne. And joining me in studio is Simon Meyer. He's CEO and founder of Future You Executive Recruitment. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Great to have you here with us. I guess, Simon, just to start with you, because you're at the coalface.
Sure.
We saw that huge drop in full-time work coming through, according to the ABS, in January.
Yeah.
Obviously, around these figures, there's always the questions of volatility and whether or not we really did see 42,000 full-time jobs exit. What are you sort of seeing at the coalface?
Look, really fair comment, Nadine. I mean, let's not forget it's seasonal adjustment time, so the numbers always look a bit funny coming out of Christmas. And as headhunters, we expect to see some stats that don't necessarily make sense on face value in January. But I think this part-time trend, it's an interesting one. And I think there's some underlying things that are starting to play out in the market, which we can get into today. Yeah,
well, introduce yourself to our guests then. So what type of headhunting, as you call it, do you do? What sort of level, what sort of jobs are you looking to fill?
Yeah, so Future You specialised in the market between 150 and 400K. We concentrate on the two major employment markets that drive that talent base, Sydney and Melbourne. And we focus on a number of different job type families. So we get a pretty good read at the coalface, as you say, in terms of what's really driving the market.
Okay, so what is driving the market right now?
I think I actually think we've bounced through that seasonal adjustment period pretty well, you know. So market is jumping up quite nicely as we move into February. And, you know, we're back into prime headhunting season. March is always a very, very big spike, you know, and there's plenty going on there.
And are you seeing a lot of strength in finance and health? In what areas particularly?
Yeah, if you look by sector, I think probably the interesting thing coming out of the break is you know, fair degree of optimism within financial services, and we haven't seen that for a while. You know, the big four domestic banks and then some of the investment banking community pretty subdued over the last couple of years, but really starting to invigorate again in terms of their project flow. And that's always good news in terms of executive opportunities.
Andrew Brushfield, perhaps we can bring you in here as well from Robert Half, joining us from Melbourne. I mean, what are you sort of seeing out in the field? What are you hearing from employers when it comes to the general jobs market right now?
There's buoyancy in the market at the moment, Nadine. We're finding across all of Australia, and we have presence across all the major capitals in Australia with the exception of Adelaide and Darwin. Real optimism. We've found the start of this year very positive, particularly New South Wales and Victoria. But we've also seen some glimmers of hope in Western Australia and a renewed sense of optimism out of Queensland as well. So it certainly started well. And as it relates to the question you asked Simon earlier around the sort of flexible workforce and temporary, we've found a steady flow of demand for temporary resources now for a number of years. What we're finding is obviously permanent employers are the backbone of companies, but where peak periods, new technology, long breaks for permanent employees, annual leave and the like, we're finding companies have a real appetite for temporary workforce, and you can see that through the trends and the statistics that came out yesterday.
Everybody talks about this, though, Andrew, as if it's a very negative trend. Is that how you see it? I mean, is it sort of Band-Aid solutions when it comes to this temporary work, or is there real opportunity there as well?
Sure. Well, I mean, we see it as a massive opportunity, and I say that both for the employer and the employee. For the employee, it enables them to get a different skill set, maybe a different view at a different company, maybe to make their way into an industry that they haven't otherwise worked in. And for the employer, it enables them to continue business. It enables them to keep their employee morale up in peak periods or busy times. It also enables
sorry, excuse me for interrupting. How does it impact morale to have temporary workers in there?
Well, when a workforce is drained, they're worked very, very hard, and longer hours than normal for peak periods. Maybe in the finance world it might be budget time or year-end time, or the auditors are coming through. To be able to ease the workload for your permanent workforce by having temporary solutions in there for a period of time, what we find is the current employees receive that very, very well, therefore are more engaged in their job, tend to retain themselves in their job for a little bit longer, and therefore morale's a little bit better.
Okay, that's interesting. So people who are in full-time work don't necessarily see the onslaught of temporary workers as perhaps a threat to their future full-time model going forward?
No, not at all, not at all. And we've done extensive research into this, Nadine. It's always a bit of a boost. New bodies, new faces, new energy in the organisation, for the most part, is always a good thing and well received.
Great. Simon,
yeah.
When you are looking at a potential list of candidates and you see temporary work on their resume, does that make you less inclined to bring them in and speak with them further?
No, I don't think so, and I tend to agree with Andrew's point. I think the Australian market, in terms of managing talent, is very in tune with the idea of temporary resources. And so when we're interviewing a senior exec and they've got an aspect of that on their CV, maybe they've had a couple of great permanent roles, and then for whatever reason they've decided to engage with organisations for maybe 12 to 18 months on a contracting basis, we don't actually look at it as a negative. What we're more interested in is, okay, well, what did they actually achieve in that contracting period or that temporary period with a particular organisation, and what skill sets can they take out of that and apply in a new environment? So in some respects, there's upside there definitely for the employee, when they come out of that environment.
And Simon, I know that Robert Half has done some research into this. I mean, is that what the research actually has found as well? Andrew, sorry?
No, that's all right. Yeah, sure, it is exactly what the research has found. I mean, in our world, we're a slightly different organisation to Simon's, in that we have three major areas of specialisation, as it were, which is finance and accounting, technology and office administration. And if you take technology, for argument's sake, it is changing rapidly. And candidates out there who may have a very relevant skill set a few years ago, the world's moved, technology's changed, the ability for them to get into new organisations to enhance their skill set is a real positive for them, but it's also a real positive for the organisation as well. So that's backed up entirely by the research that we've done.
And do you see anything, Andrew, coming down the pipeline that might change this seeming shift that we have happening from full-time work to part-time work and temporary positions in the Australian economy?
I would actually say the other way, Nadine. I personally think it's going to continue. We constantly hear about work-life balance. We constantly hear about flexibility. If you survey anyone who's left jobs, they're typical reasons that people looked to leave. If you look at younger generations than perhaps the elder generations in the workforce at the moment, the way they live their life is very different to the way elder generations do and have, and therefore that flexibility is vitally important. The other point I'd make there that I suppose Simon and I have overlooked is, work complements life, life complements work. Depends on which way you look at it. However, the truth is that sometimes people need that extra flexibility. When big life things happen, babies, moving cities, whatever it may be, and to be able to have that flexibility of working in a contract or a temporary capacity is hugely beneficial for candidates as well as clients. So for me, I personally think the trend's going to continue.
I'd probably jump in there, Nadine, and say I think there's something else going on as well in terms of a lot of work that we did last year was in the SME market or at the incubation end of the market, entrepreneurial Australians taking the jump out of corporate environments and actually starting something. And one interesting thing that occurred last year, there were a lot more people that were upfront with the corporate environment that they were part of around what they wanted to achieve in the next couple of years. And they said, look, I still want to contribute here, but I do want to spend some of my working week focused on my new idea. Do you agree with that? Are you prepared to give me a bit more flexibility? And in turn, that gives you time to think about the talent transition. And most large corporates, they want to keep that IP and they want to harness it. they've agreed to it. And so the flip side is when people get into that entrepreneurial environment, they become a new employer, you know, and they create jobs either part-time, on a contracting basis, or permanent for the economy. So that's good news.
So yeah, and that will be a trend that continues if that
Hopefully.
is the case. So Simon, if you are a person who has had temporary work, or perhaps somebody who wants to get into temporary work, how do you sort of handle that from the perspective of going out there and looking? I mean, how do you approach that conversation?
I think if it's the first time you're looking at stepping into temporary expert, you talk to the experts, you know. So you talk to Andrew's organisation, you talk to Future you talk to the recruiters that really understand that marketplace. It's very important because we can give the right advice in terms of how you take that step and maybe create a more flexible outcome in terms of what you'd like to achieve.
All right, guys, that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Simon Mayer, he's CEO and founder of Future You Executive Recruitment, and in Melbourne, Andrew Brushfield, Director of Robert Half Australia.